I'm Mara Webster with In Creative Company, and today I'm thrilled to be talking about the fantastic movie The Roses. And I'm joined today by director Jay Roach and writer Tony McNamara. And Tony, in starting with you, I love how you've kind of described how you really felt like throughout the entire movie, this is a relationship that could go in any direction at any point. You know, they could either really find their way back to each other or completely combust at any moment. And I feel like you kind of like keep it teetering on the brink of every single decision could cause either of those effects. And I was interested in how you really did that and shaped that throughout the writing process.
I think it was always the idea of how to keep the tension up, and it all became in a way to do with the character, that whether they should be together or not. And the idea was, I sort of believed I don't know what I believed. Sometimes I thought they should, and sometimes I thought they shouldn't. And I guess that's why it felt tense. And then I think when Jay came in, I think that was something we really honed into, keeping that sense of, should these people be together or not? And even if they shouldn't, one of the things I think we talked about a lot was it didn't mean they didn't love each other. It just mean they couldn't actually be together. And that seemed like a good way to look at it.
No, you're so right, because I was like rooting for them and at the same time was like, maybe they should just get divorced. And Jay, when you first read Tony's script, I know that you've talked about how you constantly felt like you just never had any idea what was going to happen next in the story. And how did that shape the way that you started to think about directing this film and wanting to make sure that that was also the experience for the audience in watching this film?
I mean, it was so well written, and I was engaged like that the whole way through, and laughing so much. That dinner scene, even on the page, made me laugh so hard that I just decided to do it just based on that. I mean, I sort of I empathized with the Americans trying to imitate the British, who were much funnier and faster. And for me, it's always tone. Like, how can you cast people who will live up to the capability that the script has, and even exceed your expectations. And knowing Benedict and Olivia were going to be in it from the get-go, that wasn't hard. And then it was just like, oh, who else can we throw into this so that they are always trying to keep up with the other cast, much less people trying to keep up with them. So getting Andy and Kate and the rest of the people that were just amazing. Belinda Bromelow, who starts off the movie as the therapist, is so amazing. We moved some of that scene to the beginning, and I just love how they're listing all the things they hate about each other when they're supposed to be listing the things they love about each other. And she's struggling so hard to just understand them, and ultimately they get each other way more than she does, and it's such a beautiful way to kick off the movie. So that's just an example of great casting, delivering on Tony's fantastic dialogue.
What was that journey to that piece of the couples therapy scene moving to the beginning of the movie? Because it's such a fantastic way to just bring the audience straight into what this relationship is and the tone of the movie. And so what was it that caused that conversation of what if we tried it here?
Yeah, in the previews, we were just noticing people were a little unsure of what the tone was of the film. It was designed to start so warm and then obviously get worse and worse, and that it still does. But by having that almost cold opening kind of connection to how much these people get each other, how much their love language is so unusual and dark, and they're saying horrible things to each other, but that they can crack up about that, crack each other up, make each other laugh, and trust each other that much is so romantic. I find that kind of getting each other's sense of humor the most romantic thing. And then watching, yeah, again, when we played it, it played so well. It's always a showmanship choice. Like, how can we get something that's playing that well to kick something off? And so it was really just being aware how the audience was taking it, and all three great actors getting to play.
It is. And, Tony, you're an Australian who's lived in the UK and spent a lot of time in the States as well. And as someone who's both British and American, one of the things that I appreciate is these two dueling senses of humor. And, at what point does the humor translate across and at what points does it not? Because they are two very different comedic sensibilities. And so I just wanted to ask about, how that went into the writing of a story like this with the characters being from where they're from and then moving to the States.
Yeah, I think I just wanted them to move to the States in a kind of, I wanted them to not have family. I didn't want them to have support. I wanted them to show their ambition, that they would just throw it in and move to a different country. And then that opened the door to this sort of we three countries speak English, Australia, but our sense of humor is sort of they literally are perfectly like that sometimes, and they're perfectly like that sometimes. And so I thought that was really funny, and then and made it a little bit harder for them at times, and that they had to just lean on each other. And then I think Jay casting Kate and Andy was like, you had this British acting royalty and this American comedy royalty. And I remember the first day on set, and it just felt like that. And it felt like both parties were like, what are we going to do with each other? And then they just clicked. And we had this great sense of, the way Kate and Andy deliver stuff is so different and all that it just kind of worked in a really tonal, slightly odd way that we thought was really funny.
It did. And, Jay, in directing this film, it kind of starts out that this couple are making little jabs and little comments to each other and asides. And over time, it obviously becomes much more heightened and grows into, kind of trying to physically harm each other as well at a certain point. How did that idea of just constantly increasing the idea of tension and conflict really shape the way that you started to make little adjustments with the way that you were choosing your shots on screen as well?
I was just reading George Saunders' book about storytelling, and he has this great phrase: "Is always be escalating." So for me, it's like predicament, and then always be escalating, but mostly towards making things worse. You start with a sort of challenging predicament, and then because of our human dysfunctions and our selfishness and greed or whatever, you tend to, make bad choices until you maybe start making good choices. And what I loved about Tony's script is that there are chances for them that they jump onto, that they do make a good choice to try to put it back together, but then they miss other places where they could have done more. And I think that's what could work about this, is that you feel like you're being brought along in a journey to empathize and share that up and down, but to almost question, how then shall we, or whoever the audience is, move forward in our own relationships, and how can we avoid missing those great opportunities?
I love that description and that idea of always escalating things as it goes along through the story. And how did that shape things for you, Tony, in crafting this? Because, again, it's these little jabs that turn into this huge conflict by the end.
Yeah, that was this sort of idea was there were tiny cracks at the start, even though they were mostly happy and they had an ability to repair. And because the way they related was sort of this funny Barbie kind of English humor, that eventually they realized they didn't have any other language. They didn't know how to be vulnerable or emotional. They were out of words kind of thing, other than mean words. And so I think it was that escalation, like I knew the language would get worse and tougher and more brutal. And that was kind of the way. And then when Jay and I were working on it, we worked the sequences to that end, to kind of every sequence sort of escalated things.
And it's also that thing where, they kind of like start off making these little asides and little comments, but actually the real things that they're annoyed about are all in the subtext and not spoken. And then eventually the quiet parts are being said out loud of everything that they've been thinking and feeling and festering. How did that really flip the script for you in a quite literal sense of now we can actually say it all out loud instead of just alluding to it?
Yeah, I think that was the dinner party scene, was how to flip the whole movie all of a sudden into a much more sort of Who's Afraid vibe that still carried the comedy of the earlier stuff, but there was a point where they couldn't contain it. And then it was like, how do they keep it together? So it was sort of definite, the dinner party sequence, which goes for quite a while, is the whole idea of that was to flip us into a much more emotional, raw place and then see how they coped with that.
But I love you spotting that so much of it is in subtext, especially in that scene. They're trying so hard to sort of front as this happy, witty couple, and everybody else is enjoying their wit so much they start trying to imitate them. But underneath, the audience, I just love those shots of Benedict and Olivia just sort of glaring at each other, while they're trying to be sort of pretend to be supportive of each other. Tony's subtext in that whole scene is really exquisite.
It is, and in the way that you've directed it, it kind of starts off with a lot of these shots where we do see everybody together on screen, and then by the time the guests leave, you just have completely isolated single shots of Olivia and Benedict. We don't even see them in the same frame anymore. And so, how did you kind of start with a cohesive group language with the camera and then move to that just to feel the real sense of distance?
I'm glad you noticed that because I was proud of the way that the second scene looked in comparison to the first. The first is pretty cutty and, just enjoying the comedy. And the second one, I made this deliberate choice to have the camera start on them, but, you see how far apart they are, but then just move back as they started to grow apart, you grow even more apart. And it was so lonely and upset, sort of upsetting and throwing you off balance watching them, coupled with these incredible lines and amazing performances, that I was very happy with the contrast and the two sort of cinematic approaches.
And Tony, there's always this constant disequilibrium between these two characters. Whenever one of them is kind of emotionally or career-wise doing well, the other one is completely faltering, and it kind of feels like they're never at the same level for very long at any point throughout the story. And how did you want them to be in constant opposition in terms of where they're at any given moment?
I think that's what I found interesting about when I took the job on. It was like, the original is amazing and I loved that, but it was really about divorce and what happens after. And I was much more interested in, I guess, marriage and how the outside world and what's happening to you in your world, your career, all of that stuff we're brought up to believe is the most important thing, how that kind of up and down outside, how you metabolize that within a marriage, and how you kind of are trying to grow together while someone's shooting in the stratosphere and you're going down, and how they try and sort of quite badly bring that together into an intimate relationship and find a way through it, I guess.
For Benedict's character with Theo, it's not just a case of my wife has become wildly successful and I can't handle it. It's my career has completely crashed and burned and my entire sense of self is completely in disillusion at the moment. And so how was that, just as an important component as the rise of Olivia's character's career at the same time?
Yeah, I think it was to make them both complicated. Like neither of them is great all the time, and they're not. And I think with I was very interested in the sort of the gender swap of it and the kind of the ego for him of losing everything and what that meant to him. And I didn't, and he still wanted to support his wife. It wasn't like he was really jealous of her, or really, it was more like, because that's why he started the movie. He's very supportive and they both really want the other person to be as great as they can be. And it just becomes circumstance of life that they don't get those opportunities. And I think that's the struggle people have in marriage. When couples both work, I think it's hard for that. It's hard to go, one of them is pouring everything into it and one of them doesn't really have a lot of options. And I think that's a real thing in modern life, that how people balance two people having careers and ambition when the world's gone. What's the most important thing? What you do and how much you've achieved and how successful you are. And yet, on one level, that's sort of the enemy of an intimate relationship being coherent. And so I was sort of interested in that kind of conflict, I suppose.
Yeah, and also for you, Jay, in directing this, I think there's something quite interesting in exploring the way that Olivia's character Ivy, she suddenly experiences this stratospheric success, and yet the thing that makes her feel loneliness is feeling so distant from her own family and her own kids and feeling like she's missing these moments. And I feel like even in the blocking of scenes, you've kind of always just kept her at a little bit of a physical distance as well. And, how did you come up with the idea of just really making sure that you were capturing that on screen?
It's a good note. I mean, I loved overlapping the joy you have for her to fulfill her dreams. She has sort of put her dreams aside to raise the kids, and then she kind of gets her mojo. And there's this great scene when the restaurant is filled up for the first time, and she's like, "What are they doing all?" Like she doesn't even know that she craved that so much, and then she just flowers. But you're simultaneously, the way Tony structured it and the way she played it, you're aware of that tragic sense of loss and that there's a price to pay for all of this. And we all have to face that, that dilemma. and decide whether, in the cost benefit analysis or whatever. And she makes a choice that is really going to cost her. And I just thought that was, a kind of beautiful and tragic reminder that, we have to be aware of the price as well as the goodies.
I also feel like we kind of witness both of them make the same mistakes at different times to a degree as well. There's the moment where Theo gets horrendously drunk on a plane by accident, and then there's a moment where Ivy gets accidentally horrendously drunk, but it's not the same night that it happens for both of them. And, how did you want to look at the ways in which, the things that frustrate them and the other are also the things that they're doing themselves at the same time?
Yeah, I think the idea, yeah, I think I wanted it to be they were quite imperfect, and even because the idea they really loved each other, but that you're sometimes just not your best, and you sometimes can't get over yourself. And I wanted that to be they kind of know sometimes they need to get over themselves, and they just can't do it. And so I was
Also,
really interested in that from a character perspective, because I think that is what happens, and they do make mistakes, and they do make choices, because it is part of the tragedy of everyone's life. You make choices and you don't see the ramification down the road, and in some strange way you couldn't, and so there is a kind of empathy I think Jay and I brought to the characters of it's sort of their fault, but it's also like sometimes it's just random bad luck, some of this stuff that happens to us, and you
but
have to kind of metabolize it.
I love what you said about that they don't that they're hypocritical about it. Like I definitely know that feeling where I'm like, upset about something, and then I'm reminded, no, that was you were the one who was acting that way yesterday, and I that's a really funny thing to spot, and I'm sure in every relationship, but I'm definitely guilty of hypocrisy in mine.
And Tony, when you were kind of structuring the later scenes in the movie and just kind of figuring out the different things that they're going to try and do to each other, which become more and more extreme in those final scenes, what was that like in terms of just playing around with all the myriad of ideas of all the different horrendous things that they could pull on each other and finding the line of how far can they actually take it?
Well, yeah, it was actually a little bit tricky the because I think tonally the movie we didn't want it to get into too much farcy back and forth. We wanted it to still stay in our tone, but we wanted them to sort of physically do stuff to each other. So we had a lot of stuff, and then Jay and I just would kind of work on it in a way. I would, go, what about if they did this? Or, we were still deciding things like I think the deep fake thing didn't happen. We were in production, I think, when I wrote that. Because we were trying to find another piece to accelerate the sequence or something. So it was just trial and error and trying to find. We had stuff that was way too big sometimes that we would go, oh, that's funny, but it's just like taking us sort of into the old movie, and we wanted to stay in our sort of lane of our movie. So there was quite a bit with that.
We reverted to our secret weapon, which was great Tony McNamara dialogue, because we did have much bigger physical set pieces in mind for a time, but Tony had the idea of why not just keep that tone like he was just saying, but have the banter continue through actually the fruit fight and the shooting and the chasing around the house. They're still delivering some of the funniest, darkest, greatest dialogue, and so we just reverted to McNamara ease.
And lastly, Jay, I also just wanted to ask you about, the design that we see on screen as a result of both of these characters' professions and just really coming up with architecturally what would Theo create as a character and food-wise, what would Ivy create as a character as well?
I love that house. Mark Ricker, our production designer, cooked up that whole house and re literally drew it on napkins the way we do in the film, and then we put the visual effects version of it on that cliff. And that was like everybody just wanted to move in there. But I also really started to love the design of the museum because this weird idea of putting a sail on top of the museum to somehow evoke maritime, history, which it is a maritime museum, and that his audacity and hubris to do that becomes the thing that destroys the building and switches their fortunes. And then on the same night, the storm knocks that sail down. I'm giving up too much, but her restaurant takes off. And so it's such a wonderful, she suddenly gets to manifest all her food brilliance, her cooking, chefing brilliance. And overlapping the two was, I think, a really wonderful part of the original script.
Yeah, well, thank you so much to both of you for talking about this. I really enjoyed the movie, so congratulations and thank
Yeah,
you.
thank you. Thanks for the interest. Good
Appreciate it.
question. Thank you.